Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're so appreciative of those that have joined us this evening. Tonight is our fourth installment of Community Conversations. So exciting. The title of tonight's event is Unpacking Our Unconscious Bias. So we have our host, Mercy Adekola, here to lead the discussion along with Trisha Hawthorne Noble from Mommy Exec Group, and Wendy Brown Helmkamp from Moon Shadow Consulting. But first, I just want to give you a little intro and background on our hostess with the mostest, Miss Mercy Adekola, who is the current president of the Multicultural Student Union, as well as a representative of the Social Justice Council based in Farmington High School. Her activism centers around racial equity and pro-Blackness, but with a strong emphasis on intersectionality between minorities. So this is like her jam, y'all. She has given numerous social justice presentations and partaken in many different conversations surrounding topics such as Black feminism, environmental racism, affirmative action, microaggressions, white privilege and fragility, and disparities in healthcare. She is graduating FHS class of 2021, and she'll be attending University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill on a full ride via the prestigious Morehead Kane Scholarship. But we have her here for tonight and for a little while longer. And with all of that, I'm going to go ahead and give Mercy to take it away.
Thanks so much, Jess. I appreciate it every time. To move right along, I also want to introduce our representative from the Reese Center, Mrs. Andrea Hawkins, who has been in partnership with us since the beginning of our webinars. The Reese Center, which stands for Race and Equity in Education, works to make transformative change towards racially just schools and communities. They envision an equitable and just world where all youth have what they need to grow and to thrive. They envision empowered students supported by conscious, critically thinking adults and supportive and safe school communities. They work towards a world in which equity is institutionalized in all school systems. I'm excited to introduce to you Andrea Hawkins, who officially began working with the Reese Center on November 16th, and she will give a brief introduction on herself and implicit bias.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Mercy. And you know, what is everyone going to do without you? I mean, you are moving out there in the world doing amazing things, and I know that we are all going to miss you and miss the wonderful energy that you've been bringing to this topic of race equity and cultural competence. So I know I want to wish you so much joy and goodness as you think about your next path forward. So as Mercy mentioned, I am Andrea Hawkins. I am the interim executive director at Reese Center, and I am wrapping up my role very soon, and I'm not going to spoil anything, but stay tuned. We are so close to naming our new executive director, and we are thrilled. And hopefully in one of these upcoming installments, you will have a chance to meet them. I won't even spoil anything about this wonderful person that we have coming on. But I am so proud, and I've been so pleased to be invited to hold down the helm temporarily here at Reese Center. And this is an amazing topic around unconscious bias. So I'm going to just jump right into it. So just to give you a little bit of background for those of you who have not participated, and a little bit of a refresher for those who have. So Reese Center was founded in 1992 by Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward, and it was initially founded as the Discovery Center, and recently rebranded. I want to say about 2.5, maybe 3 years ago, rebranded to pivot a bit more to focus on race equity and justice and empowerment in the education experience of all people, especially students in K through 12. And so Reese Center, in terms of the services that it offers, provides professional development, and there's a lot going on right now as many of the teachers and administrators are starting to ramp down their school year. There's coaching that happens, some consulting, and then just many services to really support and affect systemic change. Mercy did a really nice job of talking about our mission and our vision. And here are some of our values, right? Equity and justice. It's important for us to have relationships and really be involved in our community. Optimism, right? Seeing and believing that there is a path and a way forward. These are just a few of the values that I've mentioned, but you can see them all listed here at Recenter. We will continue to endeavor toward these values, even as we have some leadership change. But let's jump into it. And before we talk about unconscious bias, let's talk about, we also hear the term implicit bias, but we gotta start with what is bias, right? So the first thing you might be asking yourself is, am I biased, right? So I generally am doing this work all the time, and I wanna ask people at the beginning of this, do you think you're biased? I like to ask that question. And 9 times out of 10, 80% of the people say, well, I try not to be. No, I don't think I am. Ooh, people are even responding here now. And so they may not believe it, but I'm going to tell you something. We all have bias. And the sooner we embrace it, the sooner we can start to address it. So what is bias? It's our background plus our lived experiences that creates these attitudes for or against people, groups, or concepts, right? So everyone has bias. So the important thing is to recognize that you have bias and then figure out, well, what do I want to do about that? So let's dive in a little bit deeper to this idea of bias, right? So we think of bias on a spectrum, and the spectrum goes from unconscious acts and thoughts all the way across to prejudice and bigotry, right? And even farther to acts of violence, right? And can go that deep. And so when we look at the bias spectrum, I love this example. So the Connecticut House passes Crown Act, which would ban discrimination based on ethnic hairstyles associated with race. So we were so excited to hear that this passed, but we were saddened to think that someone would be treated a certain way because of their hairstyle. Like, how sad is that, that we had to pass an act to say you can't discriminate against people based on their hairstyle? All the way to what to know about the violent Charlottesville protests and the anniversary rallies, right? So all of the violence that we saw unfold in front of our eyes with the Charlottesville protests. So, right, so this range of, you know, I'm not meaning necessarily to treat anyone a certain way, all the way to prejudice and bigotry. So think about that and keep that in your mind. Stepping in a little bit more to the types of unconscious bias. So again, we hear unconscious bias. We also hear implicit bias. Those terms are used interchangeably. And there are different types of bias. So we want to look at that. So let's talk about affinity bias and the little gummy bears, right? So affinity bias is where we gravitate toward people or things that are like ourselves, right? So an example here is we might hire a candidate for a quote unquote cultural fit. So what might that mean? Well, we want to hire people who are more like us, that think like us, that have had similar experiences to ours. That's what we want. We want people around it. That's affinity bias. Then next on the top right here is confirmation bias. And this is where we're seeking or we favor info that confirms what we already believe. So, right? So sometimes you might see this, and we see this a lot in schools. There's a lot of data that shows us this general dissatisfaction with a student leads to viewing their collective performance negatively. So maybe you had an interaction with a student or someone told you something about a student, and now every time a student does something or that you don't like or you don't approve of, all of a sudden now that student is quote unquote labeled. So that's a confirmation bias. We look for things to confirm what we already believe. Bottom left here, attribution bias. So this is how you perceive your actions and how you perceive the actions of others. I love this one. So the example is, you were unprepared because you had technical issues, where your colleague, who you view as a poor performer perhaps, was unprepared because they are unreliable. Another one I'd like to give an example of is attribution bias. You might speed because you're late picking up your child from daycare, but if someone else speeds by you on a day when you're not late and you're driving a normal speed, they might be speeding because they're irresponsible or erratic, right? And then conformity bias. And this is groupthink. So this is where your views are swayed too much by the views of others. So here, the example is a colleague is sharing a conflicting perspective about a student and you change your mind. So you've had a great experience with that student, but now someone's telling you something and you change your mind and now you think that student is a bad person too. So all of these are areas to think about for ourselves. Where do we lean in terms of affinity bias or confirmation bias or attribution bias or conformity bias? Because all of us do all of these things at some point, depending on the situation, depending on, the group that we might be with, the person that we respect that might be making a comment. And so that's the important point, is to understand that we all have bias and where might we be living in one of these 4 quadrants at times, and how do we stop ourselves? So if you see something, say something. And I like to present this every time we're bringing a topic forward, because this bias exists because we are not necessarily taking steps to arrest it when we see it. And when I say arrest it, I mean stop it. I mean do something about it. I mean be a support. So what can you do? You can be an ally, or like my friend Dr. Bettina Love would say, you could be a co-conspirator and expect to be uncomfortable first. Check your own bias, right? Speak up when you see bias. Check in with the offended person and make sure you're supporting them. Exercise empathy. So empathy is not sympathy. So, right? So not feeling sorry for the person that's being offended, but trying to put yourself in that person's shoes and actually understand what might be happening. Listening more than you talk. And I love active listening. And I don't care how well you do it, all of us can do it better, especially if you have spouses or children. So how do you listen more than you talk? And then seek and expect feedback. So that's the way to show up. How do you do something? If you see something, say something. And then finally, this next slide talks about our students. So at ReCenter, we are focused on, yes, professional development with the administrators and teachers for sure, no question. But at the end of the day, it is all in service of students. We really want students to be able to achieve their fullest, highest potential. And we don't want them, having to deal with any type of bias, unconscious bias or conscious bias. We want them to feel safe and be able to be self-actualized. We want our teachers, we want to support our teachers, and we want to make sure that they have the skills that they need to show up in a way that helps those students be their best self. We want every student to feel that they have what they need to be their best self. And we really, really want to eliminate racism in the classroom and in our communities. I listed here a couple of books to just if you want to continue to explore this topic of unconscious bias. And the first one is Implicit Bias in Schools, A Practitioner's Guide, Eye on Education by Gina Laura Gullo, Kelly Capitosto, and Cheryl Statz. And then The Leader's Guide to Unconscious Bias, How to Reframe Bias, Cultivate Connection, and Create High-Performing Teams by Pamela Fuller. Mark Murphy, and Ann Chow. That is everything that I have, and I'm happy to take any questions that anyone may have. I see a note from Jay Tullen that says, the use of the words "I hate" is definitely a bias. For example, I hate the Yankees, they are the enemy, but I do really hate them. I hate this or that, like various foods, etc. That is really what I mean. Don't really think so. Not sure this is a great example. No audio today. So let's see. And Jessica asked if there's a way to get a copy of the slide with all the forms of bias. Absolutely, happy to share that. I'm going to leave that with our folks. Jessica, I'll leave that with you for sure. And I think that's, and Jay, I agree with you. The use of the word "I hate" is definitely a bias. So good observation there. Well, seeing no other questions, I am going to turn it back to Mercy, I believe. Yes? Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I really appreciate you being on with us today. And that was an amazing background to unconscious bias, which will definitely get right into our conversation. I don't know if we're going to do our giveaway now, if our giveaway screen wheel is going to appear. If not, we can definitely move on. Just waiting to see if our giveaway wheel will appear. Sometimes it appears, sometimes it doesn't. And it appears. So we're going to do 2 giveaways. And all of these giveaways are from Black-owned businesses. The first one goes to Nancy Nelson. Congratulations, Nancy. And while our last one is spinning, Kimberly Wynn, congratulations. Like I said, all of these businesses are Black-owned businesses, and these businesses include Sweet Equations, Black Made Sense, and Key Bookstore. So keep an eye out for those giveaway gifts from our winners, and we'll have 2 more towards the end of our conversation today. So before I turn it over to our special guest for the evening, I want to give you guys a brief introduction to who our guests are. So we have Wendy Brown Helmkamp, and Wendy founded Moon Shadow Consulting 4 years ago with a mission to strengthen the health of organizations committed to making a positive impact on people's lives, equity, and changing society for the better. She has over 25 years of experience advising leaders and teams on clarifying strategy, organization development and design, adapting culture, and navigating change. She has consulted to both for-profit and nonprofit organizations across many industries and sectors. Her practice of improving organizational health includes creating inclusive and equitable environments where people can be their true selves and embrace each other's differences. Wendy is also a consultant for a national DEI organization called Visions, Inc., which has been training and consulting to organizations on diversity, equity, and inclusion for over 36 years. She holds a BA in International Relations from Brown University and an MBA in Organization Analysis and Change from the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University. Wendy enjoys life through the laughter and love she shares with her husband and 2 sons, and she finds inspiration hiking with her dogs, biking on back roads, and walking in moon shadows. For her, a symbol of hope and beauty in the dark. Thank you so much, Wendy, for being with us today. And quick FYI, Brown was my dream school before I committed to UNC, literally for like 7 years. But I still got graduate school, so maybe we'll both be alum. So that's Wendy, who will be one of our guest speakers for tonight, but we do have one more special guest for you guys, and her name is Trisha Hawthorne Noble. Trisha Hawthorne Noble is a consultant with Exec Mommy Group, which is an accomplished higher education professional with a focus on diversity and inclusion, student-athlete development, student welfare and wellness, compliance, as well as program development and academic and service initiatives. Trisha specializes in educating, engaging, and evaluating, as well as equipping individuals. Trisha has her Master's of Social Work from the University of Connecticut and will be beginning her doctorate degree this year. Congrats. Here, she received the Outstanding Senior Woman Achievement Award for her academic work, as well as work in the community. She is an accomplished former UConn Division I track and field All-American, school, region, and conference record holder, 16th-time Big East champion, and former professional athlete, where she represented her native country, Jamaica. So everyone, give a round of applause to our two guest speakers today, Wendy and Trisha.
Thank you.
Okay, I can't see if you guys are clapping, but I'll take them as a yes. So I'm gonna turn it over to them, and they're gonna dive deeper into unconscious bias for us today.
Thank you, Mercy, and thank you, the Farmington Racial Equality Task Force, for inviting us here. We're really happy to be here. I also want to just shout out to Andrea for that great introduction to bias. That's really helpful to kind of start to till the soil for us as we dive deeper into that in the next hour or so. And we do have, as we go through what we want to share with everyone, we do want to make this interactive. So we hope that you'll participate when we invite you in to do so. And I'd like to actually start with a land acknowledgement. And I also want to invite anyone who is of Indigenous heritage, who would also like to offer an acknowledgement to the land, to please share that in the chat from wherever you're calling from. And so my home is located in Simsbury, Connecticut, and this is the original homeland of the Massacos and the Tungus tribal nations. I want to thank them for their strength and resilience in stewarding this land, and acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory. I also want to honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous people still connected to this land and who live here to this day. And if anyone would like to find the local tribes that originally inhabited the land where you live or where you grew up, we're providing a link in the chat to an app. It's called the Native Land, and you can just click on that. In the search box, you can enter your location and feel free to share in the chat what you discover about your hometown or where you grew up. So with that, why don't we go ahead and feel free to throw those in the chat as we continue here. With that, we're going to talk about unconscious or implicit bias. And thank you again, Andrea, for giving us a definition. It turns out that Trisha and I we both like to use the Kirwan Institute definition. And this is that implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. And implicit bias, as you just learned, is one of the many types of biases that we all practice. And we like to think that we're natural thinkers, and believe it or not, studies show that based on how the brain works, that over 90% of the time we are actually on automatic pilot, like our subconscious of our brain is making our decisions. And our brain takes these shortcuts and automatically classifies people into groups. And then we stereotype due to our socialization from a very young age, what we catch from people around us, what we're taught in schools, what we read. And so that's how, and that's where they come from. And these unconscious biases, as Andrea pointed out, they're universal. We all have them. And she pointed out 4 of them. There are actually more than 150 biases that have been identified. And Trisha, when we were preparing, there was another bias that you had thought of. I think it was that we were thinking about. talking about as well. I can't remember, it was the,
The time,
what was that?
the time when we attend or show up to events.
Yeah, I was trying to remember which way is, because I was also thinking about confirmation bias, that we look for information and data that supports our point of view or that reinforces the stereotypes we hold. So that is, just kind of some background on it. And these are some characteristics of unconscious bias. And we can start off by talking about unconscious bias as both favorable and unfavorable assessments. So for example, like a favorable assessment that some of you might be familiar with is referring to Asian Americans as the model minority. And we know that's a stereotype. We know it's a big generalization, and yet it exists in the minds of many who are not Asian American. And it can actually do great harm because people might assume that different groups in the Asian American community don't need support when they might need support. And there's so many different groups within that racial, that ethnicity. So it can actually do harm even sometimes when it's a favorable assessment.
And that's where I know that we had a discussion previously about microaggressions, and that's where those are now presented, because you have this bias that's laying there that you're not aware of, and your intent may be to say something wonderful and to compliment, but it can turn out to be pretty harmful when we talk about microaggressions. So we have to be, like Andrea stated before, we have to be aware of what our biases are in order for us to move forward. So be mindful of what the favorable or unfavorable assessments are whenever you're thinking about bias in your own institution, organization, self, etc.
Yeah, thank you, Trisha. I'm just checking the chat here. Someone is commenting, not sure where this fits. My daughter's husband is Black, and when they first got married, I had people actually ask me how I felt about having a Black son-in-law. Are you okay with that? He's a great guy. So yeah, there's a slew of microaggressions in there, aren't there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do agree that, Jay, that does go beyond unconscious bias. That's an intentional statement, but it may have been rooted from a bias somewhere, a learned, I learned experience. I learned someone is there's so much in this that I'm actually offended by the statement for you, which is why I'm at a loss for words. But as Wendy stated, there's a slew of microaggressions there, but I think it goes beyond that. And if I had to coin my own term, it would probably be macroaggressions, because the intent of this is, I know what I'm telling you, and you should probably feel a little bit ashamed, but why? Why is that there? And that's the question that we always have to ask. We have to be critical thinkers and question, well, why is this? Where did I learn this from? Why would someone say this to me? And I usually repeat things back and say, well, can you explain to me what you really mean? And then the conversation begins, but then we recognize that people are now at a loss of words, because when you ask a question about, explain what that really means to me, what do you mean by that? Then everything starts to unfold. So I will just say, continue to be a critical thinker, but also be willing to call it out. And I understand that it's uncomfortable, and I understand that not in every situation you can do so. But it's so prevalent that we have to be aware of our thoughts and how we entertain our thoughts and the actions that come from our thoughts and our behaviors. And that's really what bias is that both Andrea and Wendy spoke about before. And we will go into some other, hopefully, discussions. So please continue to type in the chat. We want this to be as engaging as possible.
Yeah, and I think also what that brings up too, that, that biases, as the second bullet says here, that they can be acted involuntarily and without an individual's awareness or intentional control. So if it's right there, that's just, something that somebody just blurts out. And I know, like for me, one way that I've experienced this that I noticed is that when I would be like listening to the radio, during COVID and hearing that like a doctor is going to be interviewed to tell us, what's going on and what their opinion is, my involuntary reaction sometimes would be just assuming like, oh, it's going to be a white doctor that they're interviewing. And then I learned through the course of the interview that it's actually a Black doctor. And so this is like completely out of my intention, and with it doesn't also align with my declared beliefs. Like I absolutely, completely believe that Black doctors are fully qualified to serve as experts and should be interviewed on the radio. So it works that way too. And so part of it is catching it when it happens in that moment, because it's like, it can just be involuntary, because it's so much of this is based on how we're socialized growing up and the messages that we get from all different directions. And the last here, that we tend to favor our own group, and we can still hold implicit biases against our own group as well. And you know, and the last one here, that the good news is that these are malleable, that they can be changed, you know, with this increased consciousness of that, knowing that we have them and that they're very prevalent. So let's go to the next slide.
Okay, have you ever, we just wanted to go over this really quickly just to talk about bias. And I know Andrea kicked it off today and Wendy has been kicking it off as well, but to think about, have you ever made assumptions? Have you ever laughing, you know, relaxedly or reflexively laughed at a joke that is offensive? Have you ever thought, you know, like the quote says here, thinking that an overweight person shouldn't be eating that giant dessert? Another example, adjusting your posture or walking or increasing your walk-in speed when you walk past a young male of a different race at night or day, treating male and female children differently, or having a discomfort reaction to gay men displaying signs of affection, or to people who are transgender. So there's a lot more, but we wanted you to think about unconscious bias, not so much that it's only race. There's a term called intersectionality where it's not just race, but it's sexual orientation, it's gender, it's where your culture, your ethnic background, there's so many things that tie into that we wanted to ensure that you're not just focused just on one, though the purpose is to talk about DEI and anti-racism efforts. However, unconscious bias is so prevalent and oftentimes you don't recognize it. And today we want you to recognize where your own biases are. We're going to continue to repeat, we all have it. So we're not pointing fingers at anyone. We're pointing fingers at ourselves and asking ourselves questions, and we're going to ask you to do the same. So here's a very quick activity that I wanted you all to all take part in. I think there are 31 participants on. So this activity highlights the dimensions, your different identities. It's important for you to address and define what your identities are. So think of 4 identities, an identifier or descriptor that you feel is important in defining you. This can be anything like Asian American, female, mother, athlete, educator, TICE, scientist, or any descriptor with which you identify. So for me, for example, and you can write them down or think about them for a moment, but I'm an educator, a mother, a wife, and Jamaican, right? So it could just be, what are your 4 prevalent or salient identities? What's something that you're like, no, this is really who I am. So I'll give you about 30 seconds to write them down or to think about what those identifiers are, because we're going to go into an activity just for another few minutes for you to think more about. So just really quickly. 4 identifiers. Wendy, do you have any identifiers that you could think of?
Yeah, I'm thinking of them. I'm thinking of a woman, a mother. I'm Jewish. I have an MBA, which you heard. I'm a naturalist, vegetarian.
A lot of identifiers and descriptors, and that's good. Another part of bias or just learning or coming to workshops and sessions like this is about acknowledging that you also have to learn. You have to be a lifelong learner. You have to recognize who you are and what your identity is and what your values are, so that, you know, when things hit you, you can say, you know what, this is who I am. These are my roots. This is who I am. So thank you, Jay, for sharing. We're going to jump to the next slide. If anyone wants to type it in the chat, that's awesome. But everyone else, just please. Okay, we have one from Joanne, retiree, mother, grandmother, African-American, and a woman. Shout out to all the grandmothers, because my daughter, grandma's savior. So thank you. We'll move on to this piece. This is the part 2 for the dimensions activity. Jessica Painter put in mother, female, mixed, and educator. So thank you for sharing those 4. I want you to keep those close to you and think about a time where you're especially proud of just one of those identities, just one of them. You're the most proud. This is who I am. Everything is awesome. And on the flip side of that, as you're thinking about that, and once you've identified that, think about another time where it was painful for you to identify with that. So for example, I'm Jamaican, I'm Black, right? So oftentimes, like, yes, I'm Black and I'm proud, but there are other times where I'm discriminated against or may face racism or concerned about my husband's safety if he goes out, right? So those things also cause much pain, even though it can bring so much joy. So pick one of the 4 descriptors or identities that you chose, and just think really quickly or write it in the chat. One that this identity has made you the most proud, but has it also brought you a little bit of pain? And if you're willing to share that experience, feel free to type it in the chat as well. So name a stereotype associated with one of the groups that you've identified, positive and negative from that experience, but fill in the following sentence. I am blank, but I am not a blank.
Go ahead,
Wendy.
No, I was going to say, so I'm a woman, but I'm not overly emotional.
Yes, that's a good one. We hear that all the time. I'm a Black female, but I'm not angry, right? We always get these stereotypes that we sometimes even believe these stereotypes, but we have to really pick it out one by one and unlearn some of the things we might have said or some of the things we've experienced that have shaped our ideologies or our beliefs. So okay, great. I'm a feminist, but I do not hate men. I am mixed, but I'm not an other. I am old, but not incompetent. I'm a man, I'm very emotional and proud to show emotion easy. So the I am, nice. But the I am not helps you to think about the different dimensions of who you are. And let's think about, though we're not going to get into a deep discussion on this, but just think about, where did these come from? Where did these beliefs come from? Right? What's sitting there? What beliefs do you have as well that you may, portray? And your intent may not to be, not to be hurtful, but sometimes we can say these things to other people or believe these things, and our actions can really relay that. So let's be mindful. And some more are coming in, so I'll just read them as well. I'm heavyset, but I'm not ill. Gay, I'm a gay kid, but I am not weaker than any straight kid. Yes, this is awesome. We need to learn about our dimensions. We need to be proud of it. Yes, sometimes it may be a little painful just because of how society is, but we have work to do. We have lots of work to do. So continue to believe in the dimensions and your identities and your descriptors. So Wendy, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to this activity as well before we move it to the level.
I'm just like, thank you for those who are participating in the chat. These are awesome.
So we'll move on. I know that I'm going really fast, but I want to make sure that we get through and then hopefully have some times for polls and Q&As. But you can continue to write in the chat. We'll read them out. We'll pause. We'll engage with you. This is about you as well. So we want to make sure that we're all learning together. So levels of bias. We'll hand it over to Wendy here.
Okay. So we wanted to talk about levels of bias and like where does some of these biases come from and what the impacts are of them. And we've been talking a bit now about the personal level. And so we've been talking about like these beliefs that we might hold of ourselves, that we just went through that exercise of like saying, well, no, they're not true. We know they're not true. Where these beliefs come from, these values, these feelings, it comes from how we're socialized. It's messages we get from caregivers, from teachers, from cultural messages we get from media, from social media. Just to give you an example, so growing up, one of the beliefs that I held was that we live in a meritocracy and that the American dream was accessible to all. And if I work hard and other people work hard, that's how you get ahead. But if I only see white people in leadership, in government, in our communities, in our schools, in our businesses, I can develop the belief or the bias that, well, white people must work harder than Black, Indigenous, or other people of color. And of course, over time, I discovered and learned that how much systemic barriers exist and obstacles that have always existed for people of color, and that is what is preventing them from so much of what has been holding people back. But that's a belief that I grew up with, and that was reinforced by people that I associated with and people around me. So that's the personal level. At the interpersonal level, the bias shows up in our behavior. So if I have these certain beliefs and feelings, then that results in how I communicate, how I behave, how I interact with others. And again, we talked about this notion of this is where the microaggressions sit, when we actually act out the biases that we hold and end up harming other people. And we'll spend more time on that as well in just a moment. At the institutional and structural level of bias, so there's actually been, a lot written about this over the years, over the most recent years. And our institutions, if we think about how many of our institutions and the practices and what we see around us, that they still continue to be, we still continue to live in a system that keeps, I would say, white upper class people in power. And that institution, those structures rely on personal biases, like instilling fear in other people, really to reinforce the system and for laws and practices and policies that get established. And, as Andrea pointed out, the need for a law like the Crown Law is really to address what exists in our structures and in our institutions. And this was pretty prevalent to the way bias was showing up with COVID, if you think about it, where the people that were dying more predominantly were Black and brown and people primarily. And there is a bias out there that some people hold that says, well, it's their own fault, they don't take care of their health and things like that. And that is a bias that is a false bias. It's really our institutions and our structures that exist that make it hard to, expensive to get insurance, or it makes it difficult to get good housing, and it makes it difficult to access healthy food. And all of those structures are reinforcing existing biases, and those biases are perpetuating the inequitable structures.
Yeah, and I'll just add there too that they're just barriers that are there, right? And then when we talk about just the education that's afforded, different areas, we could talk about so many things when it comes to institutional, but it's all systemic, and it takes policies and laws to make changes. But if the policies and laws are biased in nature, then there are always going to be marginalized populations who are left out, who have to climb the ladder a little bit harder, or sometimes can't even make it over. So we have to think about it when we're thinking about institution. We're thinking about systems and what systems are in place that could bar someone else. So it's not about pulling yourself up from the bootstrap that we always hear about when we're growing up in grade school. It's more than that. There are actual laws and policies that are in place and procedures that literally bar individuals from being able to access certain things, or just access across the board that their counterparts may receive as well. So think about it from that level, that there are different systems in place. And if you're a visual learner like myself, and there's always that picture that shows like, equity with the stools where students are trying to look over a fence, and it's gone. Do you know what picture I'm talking about, Wendy?
Yeah.
Yes. And they've changed the image now.
Field.
Yes, and the image is now changed to show like, well, you know what, great, you're acknowledging that there's an issue here and that there are barriers here. There's more work that needs to be done, but it takes everyone getting involved in their communities, in their organizations, to ensure that this doesn't happen.
Yeah, and I saw a comment earlier, Rick, pointing out that these arrows could go up as well. These levels are actually interlocking. They like all feed into one another and go different directions. And really, if you think about it at the structural level and how it's built on these personal values and beliefs, and or really they were created to hold up those structures. It's really those beliefs and assumptions about who's better than and who deserves more and who's less than, and that's just remained incredibly resilient for over 400 years. And I would say like at a closer to home level, if you think about in your institutions, like in schools or companies that are still currently white led, there are many studies that have been done to show how, the name on a resume, if it's an ethnic sounding name, that influences a hiring decision. So if we look at, the policies and practices that we have in our systems, there might be things that we can do there as well, knowing that there's natural bias going on, So what do we do? How do we rectify that? What can we put in place? This is a really old example. I don't know, Trisha, if you've heard about this one, about the, there's an orchestra that was predominantly male and white, and this goes back a few years, I think, but they wanted to change it. They knew they wanted to change their diversity, so they began blind auditions. And what they did is they put a screen in front of the musicians so the conductors couldn't see who was playing. And this completely changed the diversity of the makeup of the orchestra by not seeing who was actually playing the music. I mean, you think about that. It's like, and that was really, that's an action. I mean, that's something that's, you know, can be tried in those cases.
Institutions and organizations.
Yeah, so I'll just touch on the last one, the cultural, real quick. And I actually want to take us back to the land acknowledgement, because I do a land acknowledgement in many of the meetings that I start, or sessions like this. And I included it in this one for a particular reason. And that is because our understanding of our history and how we think about our heritage influences our worldview. And our worldview shapes our perceptions and our biases. And it's this notion of like, where do we begin our stories? Like, I learned in school that Columbus discovered America. And if that's where the story begins, I am like completely, my whole worldview is completely shaped. And the assumptions that I make about all of that is completely influenced by that. So by culture, it's our worldview. It's what we view, what we have learned to believe. Again, this is through socialization. What we have learned to believe is beauty, you know, like eye shape or hair or anything like that. What we hold up as truth, what we hold up as right. And these are all, we can be influenced culturally through media, through public opinion, through movies, through social media. And so these are all places that we really need to pay attention to, that have been influencing, could be influencing our unconscious biases. And we're gonna do a quick poll here, because we're gonna use this a concept of time for a worldview. And we're just gonna ask you to participate in this. So which sentence do you tend to agree with more? When I'm meeting friends for coffee or a drink, I hope that they arrive on time, or whenever they arrive is the right time. So go ahead, and you could take go ahead and fill out the poll. And time is a worldview. It's a dimension of worldview, because different cultures have different orientations towards time. So I'm saying, do we get to see the results?
I didn't see a poll, so we may need to just repeat it and ask people to do it in the chat.
Patience is a virtue. Thank you, Jay. There it is. I hope that they arrive on time, and whenever they arrive is the right time. So I don't know the demographics of this group, but I do know the Farmington Valley, and I guess I know the demographics of Connecticut. I can assume that the majority of the participants, I think it's safe to assume that the majority of the participants on this are white. And it's actually a Eurocentric view of time is about arriving on time. And an Afrocentric view of time is you arrive in time. And Trisha, we laughed about this, right? When we
did
doing this, like, I would answer it. I would want them to come on time.
So I'll just give an example. Whenever I plan my daughter's birthday, she's 2, I put 2 o'clock down, because I know people will show up at 3 or 3:30 or 4. I'm Jamaican, so I'm not going to say that this is more of a race, it's more of a cultural thing. We were like, yep, the party starts at 2, but it really, really starts at 4. So if you come at 2, you'll get like, a little appetizer here and there, but the party didn't really begin yet. And yeah, so we have conversations. I know I speak to my family and friends all the time where we're like, what time does it really start? Is it like the time that's on the flyer, or is it the time that's like almost the after party, so to speak, except that it's the actual on time? So yeah, we laughed about this and chuckled, and I'm never on time. I just,
Yeah.
that's what it is. I always try to race the clock or something, but essentially the cultural differences are definitely there.
And so here's the why it's so important to be aware of this is that if I assume, if my bias, how I've been brought up, is that, well, everyone should be on time. And then Trisha, if you're not on time, I could start to make judgments about you because I'm already assuming the right way is to be on time. And so just, you know, and that's, and knowing that there are those cultural differences is so important because I could just, you know, just begin to make judgments and reinforce stereotypes about it. Yeah, right, Joanne. There's stereotypes about, right, that African Americans are late. So, and just know it's so, and that's, yeah, so you're doing that really with your parents are asking you really as a, it's not like survival, it's like you're doing that as a way to protect yourself. You know, so that's, your parents wanted to really we're looking out for you in that messaging. So I hear that.
It's a moment to educate people too, because then now they'd be surprised. Joanne, I can't believe, whoa, you're here on time. Well, why would you think I wouldn't be on time? It starts at 7, right? So it's an opportunity to also have conversations and to engage there whenever that's like the surprise moment that people could not believe kind of thing. So I appreciate you sharing that, Joanne. And I think someone else also shared, Joanne also shared something else as well. Do you want to look at her response, Wendy, or should we
Joanne?
get back to it? Yes.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I didn't see the first one.
Should I read it out loud?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so Joanne says, oftentimes I run into white people who I know casually from work or organizations. I'm usually the one to call out, hey, the response is usually, oh, I did not see you. I'm wondering if this goes back to how people were raised. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, children were taught not to stare when they see something different. So fast forward, is it unconscious for the now adults to avert eyes when they catch a glimpse of someone coming towards them that are different? They see the differences first before seeing the person.
Oh, that's a really powerful statement. Yeah, it's unconscious. If that's what people are taught when they're in their, you know, when they're young and they're still doing it as an adult, it's really become ingrained and embedded. It's really hard to change biases unless it's brought to your attention, which we'll talk more about.
Yeah, and we can get back to this one too, because I think there's a lot that's packed in there, Joanne, outside of, you know, the unconscious piece is definitely there, but there's some other things that raise a red flag for me from that, just that statement and that experience that you've gone through, but I'm sure we'll be able to touch on that in different areas as we go through as well. Yeah.
So should we do that little bit of deeper dive on the interpersonal?
Sure. All right.
So microaggressions?
Do you want me to do this one? Or you...
Yeah.
Okay, so the microaggressions, I know that there was an entire workshop on this already, but essentially when we talk about the interpersonal and the behaviors that come from our unconscious biases, microaggression is a commonplace to everyday verbal, behavioral, or environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether it's intentional or not, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons based solely upon their marginalized group. And I can always give you an example. It's like getting mosquito bites, so to speak, all day long, and you're wondering, when is this going to stop? So it may seem like a simple statement that you might have made that someone, quote unquote, took offense to, but it's because if you continue to hear that over and over and over and over again, it becomes really derogatory. It leaves a negative feeling for individuals. And I can give you one. Growing up in high school in the States, because I did migrate to the States after a few years, I kept hearing, oh, you speak like a white person. Wow, you speak so eloquently. I didn't know you can speak so well. If you hear that all the time, then you start to wonder, like, wait, is something wrong with me? One, am I crazy? Microaggressions make you feel as if you're living in a different body, as if you're crazy, and you're wondering, why do you keep getting these insults? And to the person, they may think that's a compliment. Oh, you speak so eloquent. I didn't know you could. Well, why wouldn't I know how to? What are you trying to imply? And that's where we ask questions. So microaggressions can appear, again, to be a compliment, but it's oftentimes, it oftentimes leave a negative connotation and contain a meta communication or a hidden insult to the target groups to which it's delivered to. So I want you to keep that in mind, and be mindful of what you're saying, and think about, where does that come from? Where did that belief come from? You know, where is that bias? Where is that laying right now that your actions and your word also says something? So think twice before you speak, and think about how that may affect someone else as well. And Wendy, I don't know if you wanted to share, you know, a personal experience with a microaggression.
No, I would just say, like you mentioned it as mosquito bites. I've heard it, like the metaphor that I've used is paper cuts. I mean, that's really like, you know, that's really you know, that's how harsh it is. That's how painful it is. So
So
yeah.
overall, we're saying do not make assumptions. Bias can cause harm, whether it's intentional or unintentional. It often leads to microaggressions, and then these microaggressions ultimately leads to acts of discrimination. And then this can go on and on and on. But the purpose of today is to recognize, one, that the bias that we all have may cause harm. It can alter someone's life experiences and their future and where they choose to go. And it can lead to microaggression. So think about those paper cuts and those mosquito bites all day long that someone receives almost in every location or area that they go to. And ultimately, this could lead to acts of discrimination, which obviously we know there are adverse effects for. So there's a video that we wanted to show you, and it's only 1 minute and 45 seconds. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I don't think we can do both at the same time. Is there audio? In the shared screen, whenever you're clicking on it and you look at view options, you can click share audio. Zoom somehow blocks it off automatically sometimes. Would you like me to share it for you? Oh,
So
right. So let me see if I could share it on my end. I know Zoom oftentimes does not cooperate. So let's see, share sound. Can you hear that?
We can hear it now.
Okay.
bars.
Anyone? Go ahead. I was just going to ask, as you're talking, if anyone wants to type anything in the chat, what did you get from this short clip?
I was going to say that it's really hard to watch that video. And I'm saying that from, you know, a white perspective. I also, one of the things I caught this time watching it that I hadn't caught previously, well, I caught it, but it stuck with me more, is the very beginning, the mother who is, you know, having her daughter roll up her window and stopping her from saying hi to her friend, to the young Black boy. And that to me was just like a perfect example of where do these biases come from? Where do these messages come from? And in some cases, you know, those what we're really saying was outright explicit bias, not so much implicit bias with some of those looks. So that's one of the things that jumped out at me seeing it again this time.
Yeah, so one thing to point out is that bias, you don't always have to say something. Your actions, we always hear your actions speak louder than your words. And the look is serious. You might as well, you know, it sometimes hurt more than the words that you'll say, because it's the grabbing of something, it's the winding up the window, it's him in the pool and they're just staring at him saying, you know, what is he doing here? And oftentimes when you're the only, I guess we could call it onlyism, when you're the only one that looks like you in your space, oftentimes you will get the look and you start to think, you know, what was that? Was that a microaggression? Was that, where did that come from? And you start to question all of these things. So to also be mindful of your actions, you know, to fix it whenever you feel like, oh man, I might have been staring at that person, or the person that you're looking at, you know, this individual there in the video, the Black male, he felt uncomfortable. You can tell by how he was reacting, by the state of, you know, why are individuals looking at me like this? So the way that is perceived is not always going to be positive. It's not going to be the first thing that comes to your mind. So you have to think about, what are you saying? What are your actions? And where was that developed? You know, what's the thought that could be happening unconsciously, or that's trying to resurface itself?
The other thing that strikes me when I watch this is, as a white person, when I discover that the Black man is the judge, to have this moment of, oh wow, he's the judge, like I'm surprised, and why should I be surprised? And then it helps me discover, like, okay, so what bias am I holding here? Like, and I have to look at that as this aha moment for myself, and not go to this place of shame, self-shame, or blame. Because if I go to this place of shame and blame, that's a stuck place, and that I could go into that little spiral and not get out of it. So I find personally, when I capture those moments where my bias is revealing itself, I don't want to get stuck in the shame. I want to say, okay, I just learned something here about myself. I got to do better.
Ooh, I don't know what I just did. But Marcy, I think you're unmuted, so go ahead.
I was just gonna add to that too, like, just like my feelings after the video. I definitely felt like like, it wasn't surprising, but it was like painful to a point for me. Just because it's like, no matter what you do as like a Black individual in this society, like, you never like that barrier systemically isn't moving for you. No matter how accomplished you are, no matter how much money you have, no matter how many people you help, like there will always be that systemic barrier that will lessen you. And I think that that video just like really showed how like someone's personal biases also like promotes that systemic barrier. Because it's the look, or like the clutching of the purse, like Trisha said, or like the moving of your stuff, or moving of your person. And yeah, that video was definitely heartbreaking. But
Yeah, and I see their comments here as well, and I can't
Yeah,
see it.
Jay is sharing in the experience that I just mentioned.
Oh, the surprise. Yes. For me, I remember when Wendy and I were speaking, I was like, yes, he is the judge. Let's do it. I was excited for him. With the excitement, like Mercy just said, I'm like, but why do we have to be excited for this? Right? Like, yes, he's a judge. He's supposed to be. But there's something in society that just says we're less than. And that's the part that always hurts. That look does hurt. You know, I'm a mom. When I give my daughter a certain look, like, no, mommy is serious. I need you to know the look in public. That's the same type of that look of just, what are you doing here? Right. And again, it does mess with your psyche where you're wondering, well, do I really belong? We talk about imposter syndrome all the time. Like, am I crazy? Am I thinking this? Is it because of this? Do I belong here? So we really do have to be mindful. And when you are surprised, you ask yourself, well, why am I surprised? I should be excited. I should be celebrating. So we're not saying to feel guilty, but you do have to get to a point where you're just acknowledging like, man, I was wrong for thinking that. You know, why did I think that? What can I do better next time? So please think about it in the sense of, I've acknowledged it now. What can I do to move forward in that area?
I also love to say one more thing. You guys have said the word guilt a little bit, and I know Wendy brought this up as well when she was talking about her experiences with the video. And like, it's a term of like white guilt that we hear a lot, of like white people feeling guilty for certain actions, but then like that guilt doesn't progress into something tangible that then betters the situation, which is why it's called white guilt, because that's just what it is. It's white people feeling guilty, but not actually making actionable steps towards equity. And I know that this is probably going to get into you guys' next topic about action steps, but I just love that Wendy talked about that personal experience for her and how like that pushes her to make actionable steps, because like, yes, like you can feel guilty, but like, don't dwell on that white guilt, because then it just becomes white guilt and you're not helping anybody, not even yourself, really. So yeah, I'll let you guys get into how they cannot dwell in that white guilt, but I just love that you guys brought that up.
Yeah, and I like your comment too, Mercy, because you know, with white guilt, you have two options, right? You can either be silent, and silence we've recognized and learned over time and history that it speaks louder than when you just have to do something. So don't be silent in it. You have to say, I'm going to make an action to do this. Andrea talked about allyship, right? So you can be an ally. You may not really understand everything. And we're not, you know, individuals are not asking you to understand everything and to be knowledgeable and the expert in everything. However, to be an ally, you have to be able to accept a different perspective and different experiences, acknowledge that. You can be an advocate. How can you be the voice for someone else without always taking the microphone? Please allow people to share their own stories. We don't always have to take the microphone. And how can we be an activist? What can we do about giving testimonies? What can we do about writing policies? Because the folks who are writing policies oftentimes are the ones given the look. So what can we do to change the cultural systems that are in place? That's where actions come. Not everyone is going to be out there protesting and writing laws. We all have a duty. It could be at your dinner table. You may get in a little spat at the dinner table, but you know what? It's going to be okay. You have that conversation. You stay true to your values, which is why we wanted to talk about the dimensions of who you are, so you can truly figure out, who am I? What am I representing at this point? What do I want to accomplish? What legacy do I want to leave behind? How do I want people to remember? And it begins there, by not just saying, oh man, I feel so bad. I wish I could help. Yeah, that is awesome. The way you help is through doing something, have conversations. And we're going to go into just some suggestions and then we'll hand it right over.
Yeah, I just want to lift up Liz's comment too in the chat. She's asking about the language. Is bias popular now to soften the concept for white people? And Liz, I think there's something to that. I think that, well, you know, you heard that I'm also a consultant with Visions. At Visions, we refer to this as oppression. And oppression is, and yeah, and certain, and I think that oppression is a lot stronger, and oppression is really that belief and attitude of feeling, you know, some groups feeling better than, and believing other groups are less than, and often in a cruel and unjust way. And so there's something to that, and there's something to our language in general, language that we use in general, that as you're saying, is it, you know, who are we trying to make comfortable, right? So thank you, Mercy, too, for leading us into this notion. Well, what can we do? What are some suggestions for becoming aware of our biases? And we have some here at the different levels. So at the personal level, recognizing and accepting that I have a blind spot. I do have these biases, own them. And once recognized, look for it and get help to see what lies there. And a question that I ask, what have I missed before, and where is this a pattern for me? So really pay attention. And Tricia has also been naming a number of things that we can do personally to pay attention to our biases, to our blind spots. At the interpersonal level, a suggestion is noticing that someone's voice is missing and acknowledging that I never know everything, inviting others in to expand the thinking. So how can I question to ask, how can I make this group more diverse and inclusive to solve problems that are increasingly diverse? If we just have the same people together, we're at that risk of that confirmation bias and that group bias, the groupthink bias. And so we need to be with other people. We need to make friends, new friends. We need to go to new places. We need to read books by authors that we don't usually read, or see movies, or follow people on Instagram that we don't typically follow. So at the institutional structural level, and we've been touching on some of these, I know Tricia, you've been lifting up a lot of these things. Observing how my organization operates and whether it reinforces one right way of doing things. And if traditionally there has only been one way, considering alternatives. So a question to ask, what options exist in this situation? What new norms or policies are possible? And culturally examining how my own environment, my town, who I spend time with, what I read or listen to, the news I follow, the movies I see are potentially setting or reinforcing assumptions and stereotypes. And a question to ask yourself is, how can I make this group more diverse? Oh, this is a repeat of the question. It's really, how can I it's really, how can I get out of my comfort zone? How can I, you know, for me in Simsbury, drive over the hill, go into Hartford, go to different places, be around, you know, people who are different than me, and follow different people, and really proximity breaks down stereotypes. That's actually, the more that we can engage with people who are different than we are, that really breaks down stereotypes. It's repeated, consistent experiences interacting with people who are different than we are. And it could be race, it could be religion, it could be anything.
So just some action steps for you to think about. If you can think of action steps, you can type them in the chat. Mercy, I can see your face on camera. So if you wanted to also talk about some action steps that individuals can take when they're trying to unpack their biases or unconscious biases, but I will go further on unpacking how we confronting it and then doing something about it. So again, it's self-examining, identifying your biases. And I know Andrea touched on this before as well, but to be a learner, we don't know everything, and that's okay, but we need to be open and flexible and willing to learn and to accept differences. The third one is to engage in difficult and meaningful conversations. You will get into difficult conversations and you just have to learn how to navigate those. It will be uncomfortable, but it will be extremely meaningful for you to be able to get a different perspective, for you to be challenged a little bit, to think more. So just some audience feedback, and what are some action steps that you might have already taken or that you can suggest to take when we're confronting unconscious bias or unpacking it in order to do something about it. So we're not just talking about it.
Agreed. I'd also like to add to that too. A phrase that I like to think of is implicit biases lead to explicit outcomes. So the biases that you have, no matter what they are or about, like, or which group of people that they are about, they will lead to actionable steps that you'll see in your daily lives. So let's say for a doctor who has biases against, let's say, Black people, and that bias leads them not to give Black people certain pain medications, or not to be reciprocative to their pain. Or for example, a teacher who has biases against the work that a Black boy or Black student may do, which leads them to having lower expectations for that student. Or another example, a CEO or manager that has biases against certain people, and they see those people through their names when people are applying for jobs, which leads them not to hire someone with a certain name. All of those biases that are unconscious will lead to actions that you will see. And I think that that's something that you should also try to remember, is that it's through the actions that you do that your biases will then become, I think, very clear. And that's when it's beyond harmful. Yes, they're harmful when they're unconscious, but they're even one step, like that's the next step, number 2, harmful, because now you're actually impacting someone else's life. So I think that that's also another way that you can start to examine yourself through the actions that you take. So
Perfect.
That's awesome, Mercy.
All right. So we just had one quote. I'll hand it over to Wendy.
Yeah. If we had practiced more, we could have done this together, but I'll go ahead and read it. Do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. And that's Maya Angelou.
And tonight we've all learned something, so we should all vow to do better. And not only for ourselves, but really for our community, for our organization, institution, whatever it is, we can do better. So let's just try to commit to change.
Thank you guys so much. I have about 10 minutes, so I'm going to try and ask you guys at least 2 questions. So my first one actually centers around white fragility, which I feel like you guys kind of touched upon. But how do you guys think that white fragility, which I can define as to describe the disbelieving and defensiveness that white people exhibit when their ideas about race and racism are challenged, and particularly when they feel inflicted or like when they feel close to white supremacy. So how do you feel like, how does white supremacy prevent white people specifically from confronting their biases surrounding race, and how do you suggest that people work to overcome that fragility?
That's a big question.
That's a loaded question.
So one thing that I believe is the fragility comes from a place of fear. And that fear could be a fear of loss. It could be a fear of the unknown. It could be all kinds of fears. And I feel like for white people, for me, it really gets to that unpacking of where are these feelings coming from, and why do I feel this? Where did I learn this? And this is, again, it's without blame. It's like there's a system that we're all born into, and once we recognize that we're in that system of white supremacy, the challenge is to say, well, I didn't build the system, but I know about the system, so now it's my responsibility to do something about it. And so I think that fragility is, it comes to that place. It's a feeling. It's an emotional place. And so part of this is really being in tune with what's going on for me in those moments. Like when I'm, sitting on a bus and I'm the only white person, or why am I afraid? Would I feel this way if I was sitting on a bus and it was all white people? Like being able to have those really like those tricks and tips to say, question my feelings. Is this the way I would think about something if the races were different? Because that fragility, it does have a source. And again, as I said, I also really believe so much of it is how we're socialized. Like we're not born with these biases. We learn them. And so we can unlearn them. And that's really a lot of what we're saying.
Yeah, what I'll add to that is I'm going to go further than that it's fear. It's just this notion of privileged. White supremacy, when we talk about white supremacy, it's rooted in almost everything in this country. That's really what it was burst on. So when we're going to start to uproot that, people begin to feel as if, how could you? How dare you? Why would you do this? This is mine. So we start to take ownership of things that's not even ours. And there's so many things across history that we can pick from and talk about, but for the purposes of one time. Two, when we talk about right fragility, what I think about when I think about fragility, I think about something that's just easy to break. It's fragile. That's what I think of. And you have to treat it with care and tender. And that's the privilege of being able to treat it carefully and hold it and pack it nicely and put signs on it. But essentially, the only way that I think from my perspective is when we talk about privilege, it's not always bad, right? But when we talk about white privilege, it's about using your platform to help other folks, using your privilege in a positive way. And I know that Wendy already talked about the fragility piece, but I don't want it to just be fair. I want us to acknowledge that there are privileges that are at stake here where individuals feel like they can just because, one, it may be their race or their position or their socioeconomic background or their culture, whatever it is, there's something else that's at stake there, and we have to be able to identify that. So to all individuals out there, use your privilege, use your platform for the better of others. So don't be silent, like we stated before, the action steps when it comes to unconscious bias. But I'll stop because I do want Mercy to ask the other question.
No, that was perfect. Thank you. And I also wanted to add, I wanted to throw another term out there too, but just like also the term of like, we talked about white privilege and white fragility, but also the term of ethnocentrism, which is like the belief that your cultural values are superior and above everyone else's. And an example of this for people who haven't heard the term before is, let's say a white teacher, forcing a Muslim girl who wears a hijab to school to take her hijab off in school because she doesn't understand or believe that it's necessary in class. And that is not only very bad, but it is an example of ethnocentrism because she believes that her cultural values are more important than the Muslim girl's cultural values of her hijab, and by such takes an actionable step to make her remove her hijab. So if you guys wanted to add, I know you guys talked a little bit about culture with the time question, but just how do we see like that ethnocentrism manifesting with implicit biases, and how do you think, like you guys have said, educating and discussions, but how do you think people can go about navigating such an ethnocentrism?
So I can start really quickly, just in coming from a different country and a different culture altogether. Born and raised in Jamaica, moved here as a teen, and what we learn, I can't talk about curriculum enough, but oftentimes when we talk about ethnocentrism, it's what we're learning. Like I didn't even know half of my actual history in high school because it just wasn't taught. So you get to college and you're like, whoa, this is happening. And even as an adult, I'm still learning history that's just been hidden. So when we talk about ethnocentrism, there's something at stake that it's saying, you don't need to learn about this. You need to learn about this. So when we talk about the educational system and the institutionalization of what we learn and what we're teaching kids is also a big issue. So to all educators, we have to be more intentional and we have to be more committed to being diverse. In the past, we used to talk about this melting pot. And when I was in 7th grade, I think I was like, oh, it's a melting pot. This is so cool. till you get older and you realize, no, there's nothing cool about this melting pot because you're trying to make me quote unquote assimilate to be more like you, when I should be so proud of my roots, my Blackness, my Jamaicanness, my all of me, but you're telling me that I should also try to be something else. And this is why we always have so many identity crises that goes on, because we're told one thing and taught one thing and conditioned to think one way that we think we get crazy at some point in our lives, because we're like, wait, like, I don't understand. Why don't I fit in? Why do I feel like this? So we talk about ethnocentrism. It's about what we're teaching our kids now, what we're teaching adults now, what we're educated, what we're choosing to confront and say, you know, this is real. I agree, don't agree. Let's talk about it. What can people do? Start doing your own research. Facebook and Twitter is not the only way to get your news. Be a critical thinker. Read articles. See who actually wrote the article. What source is it coming from? Not every source is the best source. So we also have to do our own research. We have to be critical thinkers. We have to ask questions. We have to educate ourselves and face the truth. And that's my short answer.
That was a powerful answer. And there's nothing more I can add to it.
That's okay too. Y'all both.
No, I'll just say that I'm getting the same thing you're describing, your experience, not learning the history of, you know, your own people. Like I'm getting that same education. And if the ethnocentrism is all centered around whiteness, it connects right back to white privilege. We're just reinforcing that white supremacist and white privilege system that we live in.
And
so
people
yeah,
have a hard time. People have a hard time not accepting that. Like,
Yeah.
that's, you know, the past year and a half we've seen folks just don't want to accept the inclusive part. We accept you on the court, on the field, on different places, but here,
Right.
no. Yeah, so it's interesting.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you both for being here with me today. You guys did absolutely amazing. I want to encourage all of our attendees to drop any comments, questions, anything in the chat, any follow-ups in the chat while we do our last two giveaways. And so we can monitor your questions or comments in the chat while we do these giveaways, and we can respond to those. Okay, so our third giveaway winner of the night is Catherine Bloor. Congrats. And we're gonna have one more for this conversation today. And the winner is Debbie Vitale. Congratulations. Congratulations to the both of you, and thank you to everyone, all of our attendees for the night. And thank you to our panelists, Wendy and Trisha. You guys were absolutely phenomenal. I can't thank you guys enough. The knowledge you guys have shared with us has been beyond amazing. And I think all of our panelists can agree as well. But it is 8 o'clock and I don't want to hold anyone past our arranged time. So if there are any questions or comments or follow-ups, I'm sure that you guys can reach out individually if needed to our panelists, who you can definitely reach out. They can definitely answer any questions or comments. But I don't want to hold everyone. So thank you guys so much for joining us today. Thank you guys and have a great night.
Good night.
Thanks everybody. Have a good one.